Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
We went into the project thinking that, okay, maybe there'll be some difference. And we were pleasantly happy, not pleasantly surprised, that in fact there's all evidence of caste homogamy, regardless of what a disaster is doing, right? So even if there is a disaster and this negative shock, parents are trying to arrange marriage within the same caste. So this idea of sticky norms stays within the natural disaster as well.
Marriages in India are a universal phenomenon that continue to be characterized by rigid social and cultural norms. 90% of marriages in India are family arranged. Individuals have a strong preference for caste homogamy. Women tend to marry more educated men, educational hypergamy. Dowry payments are still quite common at the time of marriage. Given these sticky norms, how would an unexpected disaster alter these unique features of the Indian marriage market? Disasters, natural, such as floods, earthquakes, industrial, or a global pandemic, often come with little to no warning, with large-scale economic and demographic shocks to the households, both temporarily and permanently. Beyond the impact on economic livelihoods, studies have looked at fertility responses, changes to human capital formation, and other welfare outcomes due to disasters. However, these events can also change social structures, including marriages. In this episode of BIC Talks, Assistant Professor Instructional of Temple University, Philadelphia, Dr. Shreyasi Das, talks about her research on how disasters can shape marriages that she conducted with Shatanjaya Dasgupta, and in this conversation with finance and market journalist Bansari Kamdar, explores relationships and their social and economic lives and the impact sudden and acute stressors like a natural disaster may have on them. And now, over to Bansari.
It's always lovely to talk to Shreyasi. I've talked to her in the past. She's just brilliant when it comes to talking about complex economic subjects and also their gendered impacts. So I read both of your recent papers on just how disasters, one natural and one industrial disaster, impacts marital outcomes. I was sort of wondering, why did you decide to focus on marriage? I thought that was a very interesting. We've had a lot of literature come out on how it impacts health. And I think you'd address that in the paper of why it's important to talk about socioeconomic outcomes of these disasters. And I was wondering if you can expand on that.
Thanks, Bansari, for that question. And it's lovely to talk to you again in this capacity. We've had wonderful conversations before as well, and it seems like a long time since then. Thinking about marriages, right? I mean, let's take a step back and think about how we as Indians especially consider marriages, right? Marriage is something that it's kind of drilled into us even when we're younger, that at some point in your life you must get married. And I think this is true even today. And the data suggests that, there's everyone at some point in India has been married. Unmarried, if you look at the unmarried statistics, it's pretty low. And you can go through different census years, and you'll see like about 80% to 85% of folks have been married at some point. And when I say have been married at some point, it could be that they're currently married, they've been married and divorced, or they're widowed or separated. So given this such a large portion of folks of the population who are married, it's always interesting to see what kind of things can, kind of ruffle feathers in this marriage market. Mm-hmm. And I use the word market because, coming as an economist, I will say things that are a little econ oriented. So let's think about this marriage market. But going back to the point about why marriages, especially marriages in India, and if everyone has at some point, the listeners to this episode at some point has heard about Seema Auntie and Indian matchmaking, we see very deeply rooted socio-cultural, patriarchal norms that play out in marriage markets, right? So, to give you a quick background on this, about 1% of marriages in India result in divorces. And of course, this is just what we're looking at in the data. So, divorce is still very uncommon. It's still quite a taboo. There's this really big preference of caste homogamy, right? So talking about what do we mean about caste homogamy? Caste homogamy means spouses or families really want these marital unions to be within the same caste. And there's some like leeway in terms of, should we think about subjati or jati? But at the end, caste homogamy is really important. And it really doesn't matter thinking about this in terms of socioeconomic levels. I've seen this play out in the US market as well, where, friends who came here for their higher education, for example, and we're meeting folks, they always said in the back of their head, like, we want to make sure that they speak the same language, whoever our choice of spouses are, they speak the same language, they're within the same caste, because we don't want our parents to have any issues later on. And that's an interesting thing to think about, that they're also within this, self-arranged marriage where they have this quote unquote love marriage happening. They're still thinking about parental consent, right? So parents play a big role in these marriages. Arranged marriage is a big thing, even in India today. Again, going back to a very, very recent example of looking at Seema Auntie, for example. But then there's this idea of consent within marriage, but consent through the parents as well. So the data, there's an interesting question in some of the data, which is that, was it a self-arranged marriage, meaning a love marriage, or was it just purely parents arranged or parent arranged with consent? So basically the parents say, we found this match, and then you can go say hi to this person, see if you kind of like this person. So given these very sticky norms, very rigid norms, there's also a whole bunch of things like dowry payments, even though dowry payments have been illegal since 1961. It's interesting to think about, would there be something that disrupted this marriage market, that disrupted the sticky norms? Or is it so rigid that come what may, heaven and earth coming together, that, these marriage norms don't change whatsoever? So that was the premise of thinking about this research.
That's very interesting, because we do see that, like, when we go into your research, one of the papers deals with the Bhopal gas tragedy, where it's an industrial disaster. The other one deals with the earthquake in Gujarat, which is a natural disaster. And we see these sort of, as you said, sticky norms play out in these like disastrous situations. And I was wondering if we could first expand on how they play out differently in men and women, since I think the Gujarat paper deals specifically with how it impacts women and women's marital outcomes, and the Bhopal paper deals with specifically how it impacts men and their marital outcomes.
Disasters in general, you could think about, are sort of this negative shock. And economists are always thinking about what may happen when there's an income shock, when there's a livelihood shock, when there's this shock to, even if it's positive, for example, but what happens to economic outcomes? And thinking about marriages as an economic outcome seems kind of strange. And apologies as an economist, apologies to everyone thinking about marriages as a market. But it's interesting to think about, there's this potential shock that could be one term or one time, thinking about a natural disaster, for example, but also an industrial disaster, or in terms of a chemical gas leak. So, for example, the Bhopal gas tragedy, it could seem like a shock that just happened, but it could have varying long-term outcomes, right? So an earthquake hits, a flood hits, a hurricane hits, it stays for, let's say, a couple of days, and then you think of long-term impacts. But an industrial disaster, on the other hand, it could have spillover effects as well. And just to give a quick background on what we think about spillovers, it's not just, there's a gas leak and there's pollution, air pollution, for example. There could be water pollution. So they're spilt over into the water streams. It could be that the groundwater is now polluted completely, and people for generations are in fact facing the negative consequences of this. So a natural disaster could just be it could be one generation, and I say that very loosely, right? Of course, there's intergenerational potential impacts to this. But an industrial disaster, it just seems much, much, much longer than a natural disaster. So even in the context of the Chernobyl incident, for example, the Fukushima nuclear plant, for example, right? So these could have longer term effects. Going back to the gender question, it's interesting to think about how these disasters may in fact have very different gendered effects as well. Now, going back, I'll just focus on the natural disaster for a second. So, a natural disaster, think about an earthquake, which is what the premise of my study is, one of the studies. And the earthquake, specific earthquake that we are talking about is the Gujarat earthquake, which happened on 26 January 2001. And for all of us, maybe some folks who are listening to this, you may remember as well that there was an earthquake when you were standing during school assembly and potentially, having some Republic Day celebrations. And that's when the earthquake hit. I was in Hyderabad, and this was exactly the setup, and we felt a little tremor, right? So this is very well etched in memory, but thinking about how men versus women may be affected by this, there's a large literature that looks specifically at women and disasters. Women in general may be working in the house, right? So they're taking care of household chores. And so when this sort of disaster hits, they may be the ones who may face a lot more casualties. We say that women and children are usually the most vulnerable in terms of disasters in general. They may not be able to contact their husbands. I mean, this is the time that WhatsApp wasn't even in place. I mean, mobile phones weren't in place either. They may not be ready in terms of thinking about how they should react to an earthquake, right? So they may be at home, so casualties might be higher amongst them, injuries might be higher amongst them. But there's other repercussions as well. With an earthquake, for example, or some other natural disaster as well. I don't want to harp on the fact that this could only happen during an earthquake, but phone lines may be down completely, right? You may have infrastructure losses. And so if you're trying to contact someone, that could become a problem. There's research that also sees that, women aren't able to contact police, for example, if there is, in fact, higher incidences of domestic violence, and we see that play out as well. Not just thinking about that, we also see longer term effects of this. Mothers may suffer a loss of a child because of this disaster. Parents in general are saddened by this. And so we also see this increase in fertility, that, you want another child potentially. And you may also see this decrease in birth spacing, right? So you have children at a much higher frequency. That could obviously impact the health of the mother as well. Right, so we know that these take tolls on women's bodies, so it could end up being really bad for their health as well. We've also seen this play out in terms of adolescent girls, right? So adolescent girls may be taken out of school and they're expected to take care of household chores, but then also adolescent girls become really, quote unquote, costly to have in the house, especially unmarried girls. And so we could end up seeing this increase in child marriage, especially from the women's side. Now, in the industrial disaster side, things may be slightly different, right? When you have an industrial disaster, when you have, for example, something that's really known in the news, so let's take the Bhopal gas tragedy, for example, people may have these preconceived notions, or people may have these very discriminatory views about someone coming from that area, right? So let's think about a person who's sort of ready to get married, but just has the tag that they come from Bhopal. Now, all of us, we have some sort of idea that if someone comes from a certain place, they may or may not be telling the truth about their health status, for example. So a person from Bhopal may have this social taboo, this taboo against them, that they may have been born either very much after the tragedy or just right after the tragedy. So they may have some health issues that they may not be revealing. And this is what is causing some issues in their marriage, right? Now, the reason we focused on men in this is, one, because the data is really what we were going by. The data was rather directing us in that sense. But the other issue was also that, if you think about it, and going back to how matches are made in India, whenever a daughter's family is thinking about where the daughter should get married, there's always like, okay, this is a great house. This seems like a nice family. The guy seems like they're able to earn and provide livelihood. Well, if the expectation is that the man of the household will be providing for their daughter, for the family, given this fact that they may be hit by a chemical gas leak, which could impact their health, which could then impact their education, and then also impact their ability to earn later on, that could be a problem for these men, right? So if they are not employed, they could in fact not be able to get jobs, which means that they may not be very attractive in the marriage market, meaning they won't get married for a while. So this is the angle we tried to go with with the industrial disasters paper, but not to mention we've kind of looked at the women's side as well. There's lots of reports that talk about how in fact not just the individuals who were physically impacted by this. And when I say physically impacted by the Bhopal gas tragedy, I mean there's visual cues that there's something health related. Even their siblings who may be perfectly, quote unquote, looking the way we want them to, they also have a hard time finding spouses, because the idea is that they're related to this other person, and so they may also carry something that doesn't look very attractive in the marriage market. We focused on the men in the Bhopal paper, but we also have a sidebar about the women in the area as well. It's also because, again, going back to the idea that the data kind of directed us this.
What I thought was interesting was you almost see this sort of divergence in outcomes for women and outcomes for men, where I think in the Gujarat paper, you see that women are married off earlier. And with the industrial Bhopal gas paper, you see that men find it difficult to sort of find a spouse. We can go back and forth over the papers. And I was sort of wondering if you can expand more on, say, the age of marriage and how that is impacted by unexpected disasters. We can start off with Gujarat.
So the idea is, why should we even think that the age at marriage should get affected, right? And this sort of goes back to the concept of these norms I was talking about. But here's a disaster that hits, okay? And it could very well be a really bad disaster, a really bad economic shock to some of these families. And one way to mitigate this is to think about, what do we do with a daughter who's in our household? Now, in these situations, daughters might end up being what we know as pretty costly. They may be considered as a financial burden. And this is very well documented in the literature, right? That women, when daughters are born, parents are in fact saving a little more because they have to think about dowry payments later on when they're ready for marriage. So thinking about age at marriage in the natural disaster case, this is the primary mechanism. This is the primary underlying factor that we're going with, which is parents may now consider these daughters to be a lot costlier to have an unmarried daughter at home, because maybe they've gone through a loss of livelihood because of this earthquake. And so you sort of shift the burden of having this daughter onto the future groom's house. But then you may argue that, okay, if this is the case, well, why is it that the husband's family, the future husband's family, is going to take on someone, especially if they've been impacted by this earthquake as well? Why should they agree to take on this girl? And this is where the dowry payments come in. Dowry payments may go up because the husband's family says, we are taking in your daughter, but we sort of need these payments to happen. And it could also signal that they are, in fact, asking for these dowry payments potentially for marriages of the husband's sibling who may be a female, right? So if the future husband has sisters, this is one way of funding their marriage as well. So
Then you may say, well, okay, that's the dowry side of the aspect, but why in fact do we see this decrease in age at marriage? And this is going back to a lot of literature that's looked at what is the relationship between age at marriage and dowry payments. And you find that in fact, the lower the age at marriage, the lower the dowry payment. So there's this positive correlation between age at marriage and dowry payments, where you think about, okay, if I get my daughter married faster, I may not have to pay that much dowry. And that's exactly what we are finding, which is the earlier the marriages take place, the less amount do they have to spend on dowry. It also means that, these girls are in fact spending less time in education. And we also have this sort of positive correlation between education and dowry payments. Okay, so the more educated you are, now it's a more competitive market for the women as well. And so they may end up having to pay higher dowries to in fact get married. This is sort of the channel that we're thinking about.
What I thought was very interesting was the fact that, like, as you said, dowry is illegal in India. So I was wondering, how do you account for that when you're doing a study like this? And this may come a little more from the economist side of me, but I was really fascinated. We could have it be a little technical, but I was really fascinated by how did you go about.
Sure. So the data set that we're using actually has this question, but it's sort of a proxy question, right? There's always reporting bias in all of these data, but you want to know what's happening. So one of the ways they do this is by asking the question, in your community at the time of marriage, so sort of getting around this problem of illegality and scaring off the responder by saying, okay, at the time of your marriage and at the time of marriage in your communities, what sort of payments are made, right? And it doesn't necessarily say payments, it's like how much gold was given and how much cash was given. So not directly asking with the words whether dowry was paid or not, but just sort of asking wedding related expenditures, right? So that's how they go about it, which is wedding related expenditures. And we use that as a proxy to say, okay, at the end of the day, these are still gifts that are being given, but we all sort of know what these gifts are about. There's another data set that actually specifically asks this, and that's the REDS data. And the REDS data has information on dowry payments. There are a couple of papers, in fact, that has said that, dowry payments have looked pretty stable since 1970s in India, when that shouldn't be the case. And they say that, parents are in fact saving for dowry payments later on, especially when they have a girl child. So that's how we're going about measuring it. It's not the perfect measure, but the wedding expenditures is not a bad idea, right? I mean, you're thinking about, okay, can you tell me sort of what happens in terms of expenditures? And that's a nice proxy for us to think about.
Absolutely. We also talk about other variables in marriage that are impacted by, we can start with the natural disaster, with the earthquake. So what are some other sort of preferences that are changed? How do individuals react to this? Just when you have a disaster such as like the Gujarat earthquake or a flood, as you mentioned, what are some other factors that would change?
Let's think about other, again, economic outcomes that may not seem economic outcomes. So we're going to talk about them in the context of demographic outcomes, right? Literature has actually found that there's educational hypergamy in marriages, but it's on the decline. And when we think about educational hypergamy, it means that women tend to marry men who are a little more educated than them. And this goes back again, very, patriarchal in thinking, paternalistic in thinking, that the man should be a little more older than the woman, right? So that's something we think about, which is what is the spousal age gap and also the spousal education gap, right? So in the natural disaster paper, we actually find that both men and women, their age at marriage decreases, but we still see some evidence of this educational hypergamy. thinking a little bit more in economics terms, you're thinking about this quantity-quality trade-off, and I promise that's the last econ term I'm going to use. So the natural, like a disaster hits, and the number of people available to get married may change, right? So you may have a very high casualty disaster, which in fact the Gujarat earthquake was. The numbers are high. It's about 20,000 people who died. And so now your sex ratio of the people who are in that marriageable age, so thinking about marriageable age, anyone above 15, for example, even though it should be 18 and above, but we have data on people who are 15 and above who've gotten married, that number may change. So just thinking of a purely quantity-based thing, this is changing. And now thinking about the available pool of people who are in fact of marriageable age, the type of people are in fact changing now. And so again, going back to this, going back and forth between the industrial and the natural disaster, thinking about the type of people, it's that these are people who survived the disasters, but there's other effects that may come about. But now they may be of lower age, higher age, they were just waiting to get married, but then the disaster hit. So, these are folks on the margin that were about to get married but can't get married now. They may have been completing their education, and suddenly the disaster hits and the infrastructure is gone. And so now their education has stopped, or they now have to drop out of school and help out with the families. So these are sort of things that get impacted beyond the disaster effects that we're very used to hearing. And so this quality versus quantity trade-off, the pool of people available, is very interesting to think about. And so there's literature that's actually looked at some disasters. There's some literature that's looked at the Chinese famine. There's some literature that's looked at the Fukushima incident. And they also find these sort of health effects, even if you were affected by it versus not affected by it. And people tend to think that you're not as attractive in the marriage market, right? And now attractiveness doesn't always have to be health related. It could also be this education related, right? So how attractive, someone has your bio data and goes around giving this bio data. There's that education aspect in there, right? So this is also part of this attractiveness. And so we thought about this, and given that, there's evidence that educational hypergamy is quite prevalent. Again, I need to add that disclaimer that it is on the decline, but not as fast as we would expect it to be. We decided to look at educational hypergamy, and we see that even after this, there is some prevalence of educational hypergamy. And our most favorite outcome, and this is an academic talking, is looking at caste homogamy, right? And then some other stuff that now, as we've continued with the research, we've sort of taken it out from the main paper, but I like talking about it, is that we were thinking about women's bargaining power as well. And just very quickly, there's a huge literature that talks about women's bargaining power, especially if they're married very young, what bargaining power looks like. So are they able to assert their choices within the household, within the marriage? There's lots of literature that looks at their fertility decisions, their education, their employment, just, allocation of resources. Are they able to, in fact, say things about what should be spent on? But we just wanted to take it very simply and think about whether we see this parent-arranged consent with the daughters go up or not. And we do, in fact, see that. I think I'm remembering this correctly, but we don't see too much about the self-arranged marriage. But we see this parent-arranged marriage going up, right? And that's, again, thinking about what we see in these marriages in India. And this is, I don't know what the right word to use it, but it's kind of okay to see that, okay, anything that you thought about in terms of, okay, this happens in India and this happens in marriages in India, it continues to stay regardless of. that. And I just want to go back and say, I am talking about this in the Indian context, meaning marriages in India, because that's what the research is focused on. But again, I have to say this, it also carries over elsewhere as well. And I see this happen quite a bit in the US, where, this caste homogamy, educational hypergamy also tends to prevail quite a bit.
So, what was very interesting when you talked about caste homogamy was also something you mentioned earlier about the age of marriage and like how the age of marriage might be lower for girls after such disasters. And I was sort of wondering if there is any relationship between caste homogamy, parental arrangement of marriages, and sort of the age of a woman's marriage.
So I don't know if there's something that I could say in terms of caste and age at marriage, but I think I can talk about how cost of finding a marriage can change, right? So there's a disaster that hits, and now you have to, let's say, find a spouse for your daughter. And the idea then becomes, okay, should I find someone that's within the same area as the natural disaster or the disaster in general? Or should I find someone that's outside of this area because I don't want my daughter to face this sort of problem again? So you could think of this as altruistic behavior, right? So if parents are truly altruistic, regardless of the fact that, they do want to get their daughters married away earlier, but if they are altruistic in nature, they want to make sure that their daughters are taken care of, right? They want them to get married into a household where they are truly taken care of. So if that's the case, then you want to make sure that a search is found somewhere other than where the disaster has hit. That could increase costs of finding someone, because how far away should you send your daughter? Now, one thing also to keep in mind, that migration related to marriages within India is not what we think of as. Most marriages, in fact, stay within the same district, forget outside of state. So about 3/4 of marriages, in fact, stay within the same district. So if that's the case, some of these marriages are happening outside of the villages, and for some you could see that they're in fact happening outside these villages. And you could think about this as parents being a little more understanding, they're more altruistic, they want to make sure that their daughters are taken care of. But the other side of this argument could be that this increased cost may in fact be increasing or delaying the age at marriage, right? So it could be that you're waiting for a really long time to find someone outside of the village, and now you're just like, I can't wait this long for my daughter because she's growing older, right? Even if it's by a year, even if it's by 6 months. So then you may say, okay, fine, I'm going to take the first union that comes along, the first marriage choice that comes along. And so it could be that it's into a household that's not that great, but okay, right? So we find this result that they're not getting married into better off households. They're just getting married into any match that comes along. That could be the case. You could also see, and there's some literature that looks into this as well, and this was originally our thought process as well, which is that you could see marriages happening amongst relatives, but we don't see too much of an effect of that. But there's some indication that could be happening of consanguineous marriages.
That's very interesting. And I was sort of wondering, like, now we can get to the other paper on the industrial tragedy, and you look at men there specifically. And as you said, you also look at women, how the age of marriage changes for men after the industrial tragedy. And the paper divides men into two parts, right? If you can expand more on that.
Sure. So you've done your research.
I found it very fascinating. I feel like I started with the abstract and I was like, you know what? If I read the abstract, I know Shashi will know exactly what to say. And then I just got so into it. I had to read everything. Hence, I had to ask you very technical questions in the middle because it was just very fascinating. And I know that you have such a great grasp of the subject that you can condense a lot of these very complex matters into very, very understandable.
You're too kind. Okay, so let's think about this. So the Bhopal caste tragedy hits, And again, there's a high casualty. Unfortunately, we don't have really good numbers at all about what the true death toll was. But you also know that a lot of people are still suffering, right? So adults at the time of the tragedy continue to suffer. But children who were born after the tragedy also continue to suffer. It could be that they're drinking really bad water because the radiation wastes are in the water. The toxic chemicals are in the water, not radiation, but toxic chemicals are in the water. And so it got us thinking about the fact that there could be two margins. There could be two cohorts. And within these two cohorts, you could see different effects happening. Right? So consider a 21-year-old at the time of the tragedy in 1984 versus a child who was, let's say, not yet born or was in utero, as we call it, or a 1-year-old at the time of the disaster. So they could have very different effects. And that's exactly what we see as well, which is the adults. So folks who were already born before the disaster but are just waiting to get married, we actually don't see any difference in their marriage probability. So we do see that they're getting married, but conditional on getting married, we see this delay in marriage. So their age at marriage actually increases. And just taking a step back and thinking about why that may be the case, you could say, okay, because there's this social taboo of being from that place, we could in fact see that they're having a harder time to find a match, right? So if someone says, there's this person from Bhopal who wants to get married, the girl's family might say, I don't know if that's a good idea, because we don't know if they've been affected by the gas leak. There may be health effects later on. Who knows if they're going to be able to have children later on or not, so on and so forth, right? But then thinking about the children, we in fact see that the children have a much lower probability of getting married. And on conditional on being able to find a spouse, we see this early marriage happening, right? So their age at marriage actually decreases. And I think we need to think about why this is happening, considering both of them should have this social taboo of being part of the Bhopal area. And this goes back to this idea of asymmetric information. I know a lot about my health than the other person in front of me. So if you are from that place and you're trying to get married, your best solution is to not reveal any of the health effects that you may have. So maybe you don't say everything, or you may also not have any effects of it come out, right? So you're just in the zone rather, or you're just hoping these effects never show up. And one way to make sure that it doesn't hurt you later on is to get married earlier. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the children's case. We also see like these health effects, and there are papers that have looked, there's a whole lot of literature that's looked at the health effects of the Bhopal caste tragedy. And you see these varying effects between children, between in utero, between adults. Folks have talked about how children may have gotten a lot more affected because the gas was so heavy, it was sort of floating near the surface. And so the children, because they were of lower height, could face the gas effects a lot more than the adults, right? So that's why we divided these men into two different age groups to see how different their effects would be.
What I thought was also interesting was sort of the other implications of this, right? Like in this paper, when you talk about like also the women they're marrying are a little older. And I was sort of wondering if you could tell us more about why that would be the case.
Yeah, so I think it all goes back to being able to find a spouse, right? So even if you're a woman in that area, I think it's harder for you to find a spouse, much harder than finding a spouse for men, right? Because now you have this associated problem of, will she be able to bear children? Will she be able to take care of the house? So if she has certain health effects, women bear a larger, much heavier, higher burden of that than men do. And so we do find that as well. And so the search cost might be much larger for women. And that plays out. We also see that, when, again, going back to talking about spousal quality and we have to take this result with a big ounce of salt. We look at asthma prevalence, we look at cancer prevalence, and they're matching with each other based on their health, right? So maybe someone has asthma problems, they're matching with folks who also have asthma problems. I don't want to make too much of a comment on the cancer stuff, because cancer is, you can imagine how hard it is to actually say that you may have had cancer, and then it's also based on the folks who have survived that tragedy. So there's a lot going on. So I don't want to make too much out of it. But there are some papers that have looked at whether cancer incidences have gone up, and there's some evidence to see that they're more prone to cancer in these regions. So for women, it's again, going back to your first question, there's this gender disproportion regardless of what kind of disasters, and this definitely plays into it quite a bit, where women may find it much harder to actually find a spouse, because going back to a sticky norms idea, there's this quintessential idea of what a female spouse should look like, right? She should look pretty, she shouldn't have all of these problems, things like that. So that makes it harder for them to find a spouse.
Following up a little on the sticky norms, and we talked a little about caste homogamy with the earthquake and how like those norms are still sticky, at least in that disaster. And I was sort of wondering over here, when men are also finding it difficult to find spouses, and it can be argued that they might have a slightly more bargaining power when it comes to who they marry. Do we see any difference with caste homogamy here?
The short answer is no. We don't see any difference in that. And it's quite, things may change because it doesn't look like what we've been used to. But there are certain things that are just really grounded in discriminatory behavior, and this sort of thing plays a role over here. There's no difference in caste preferences, right? In the sense that people do want to get married within the same caste, people want to get married within the same religion. So we have these very set thoughts, and those continue regardless of what's happening.
Definitely, that's very interesting. So one of the things I was wondering was just like a broader question, how this impacts like other disasters, right? What we know so far, what we've found from these papers, what does this mean for other disasters we've seen?
So very interestingly, most of the literature has found very similar results, regardless of if it's a hurricane, if it's a flood, if it's an earthquake, if it's a famine. What's interesting to see is that there's not enough literature that's looked at these industrial disasters. So we were really trying to search other papers that have looked at the Chernobyl incident, for example, and we couldn't find anything that looked specifically at marriages. All of them definitely look at education and employment, and that really helped our case, in fact, that, you know, if folks are finding it harder to find matches, it could be that they aren't up to par in terms of the education requirements or the employment requirements. They may be unemployed quite a bit. But we just are coming out of a pandemic. Some folks have started to think about, you know, we need to look at what's happened to child marriage. And there's folks since the pandemic who've been trying to document whether child marriages have gone up during the pandemic. Now, that's a hard question to answer, especially without any sort of measurable data. But lots of organizations on the ground are trying to make sure that they are documenting this. So UNICEF had this big report that's looking at child marriage during the pandemic. There is quite a bit of evidence to show that, you know, there's an increase in child marriage. And this is, again, relying on all of the surveys, all of the door-to-door surveys that are being done by individual organizations on the ground. This is going back to what you would expect, which is a lot of children have dropped out of school. Girls especially, again, bear the brunt of this. Schools had been locked down for a really long time. Even though the country was opening up, schools were in fact not opening up. In fact, if I'm not wrong, and someone may correct me on this, India was one of the last countries to open up schools. Given that, and we had online education wherever people could in fact access online education, girls with phones are always a no-no, right? Parents may be very much concerned about girls being on their phones. They're at home. They're a little bit more risky to have at home, unmarried especially. And again, going back to this idea of having a daughter can be costly at this point, because a lot of these parents are also wondering about their own livelihood. We do see some evidence that child marriages have been going up. So whatever we saw in terms of natural disasters, of industrial disasters, we're seeing this over here play out in the pandemic as well. But I also want to mention that this is sort of true for boys as well, right? So boys, they're not at home, they're not going to school anymore, they must start working. And we could see that they're also getting married earlier. So this phenomenon may not just be a disaster, quote unquote, a disaster specific thing. It's also very true of the pandemic. So what the economists call, right, there's sort of a generalizability of this. This is external validity problem, not anymore. That there's sort of a generalizability that regardless of what a disaster looks like, we should be paying attention what's happening to these children and what's happening to child marriage. Because again, I want to harp on something that you had asked about in the beginning, which is, why should we even think about this? And the argument is very simple. It's that these children are not going to school anymore. This hurts their future employability. But women, adolescent girls especially, have a higher burden of this. They may get pregnant pretty soon. So teenage pregnancy may happen. And that's very bad for maternal health. This obviously puts girls at a higher risk. We may also see higher risks of domestic violence come about. To be really honest, we need to pay more attention to this than what we do right now.
Absolutely. We started this conversation on just this question that you raised about, is there something that disrupts the sticky norms that we have right now? And I was sort of wondering, are natural and industrial disasters some things that can change some of the sticky norms that we've seen so far? You've said no with caste homogamy, but other sticky norms we've seen in marriage and marital outcomes so far.
I don't know if it is true that all these norms have changed regardless of a disaster. In fact, I would say that certain outcomes become worse, right? And just looking at this age at marriage, it becomes worse, right? So what needs to happen, and I say this with a word of caution that I'm not trying to say things that will suddenly change the world, but also policymakers need to think about what these disaster management acts actually do, right? So we think a lot about rehabilitation, and we think about recovery effects. And we think about, we should be giving livelihood assistance, which is perfect, which is exactly what we want to think about, especially because, these folks have had income losses. But we also need to actually put in certain things in these policies or these disaster management acts that say, we need to make sure that these children are taken care of. We need to make sure that these children aren't facing what we've seen in the past, which is that they get married earlier. So I think that's something to think about in terms of, if we want these sticky norms not to stay, in fact, the disruption to happen, there has to be sort of this policy-oriented solution as well, where, of course, having the policy written down versus implementing it is very different. But I think we need to think about it, that maybe we should not let these children drop out of school. The infrastructure stays in place. We need to make sure we're accounting for them properly. That may help a little bit in sort of disrupting these sticky norms. But again, I don't want to make this claim that this is only because, the disasters are in place. The age at marriage, yes, of course. But the other stuff like, educational hypergamy, caste homogamy continues to stay quite a bit regardless of whether there's a disaster or not. And again, going back to what we see in everyday life, there's preferences that do not change whatsoever.
That's very interesting. I'm out of questions. But it was lovely talking to you. As usual, it was very educational. Also, I'm going to look into that data set on Dowry systems for sure. That was a very interesting way to go about it.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for BIC for giving me this opportunity to talk. It was lovely to talk to you again, Bansari. Thank you so much.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, please share it with family and friends. You can also leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible are Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studios. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. Do follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to get regular updates on our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.